This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. We have the guru himself, the man, the myth, the legend, Jim Nasr. And as you can tell, he is the face, he is the leader of Acor. And as Acor is leading the world in the context of all things DLT, we reach out to the Jim Nasr to ask him questions about what's going on. Jim, you want to introduce yourself?
I don't think I could do a better job. In fact, I definitely couldn't do a better job, and I certainly couldn't keep it much less off the level. So yeah, I'm Jim. I'm the founder and CEO of Acor. I don't know if we're legends of any kind, much less in DLT, but certainly we try. You know, we're kind of we build software, right? That's what we do. We blockchain enable software where it makes sense. It doesn't make sense in every situation, right? You know, I'm sure you know this, Darshan, as we've spoken about this, and you have a lot of your own experience. It's not blockchain is not a hammer looking for nails, right? But we got to be a lot more, precise and surgical, and a lot more intentional about where and how and why we use it.
Well, you say that, but I remember literally someone a few years ago literally just people were throwing the word blockchain around just to be able to raise the valuation of their products and of their companies.
Yeah, so it worked.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, first of all, I don't really know. I didn't follow them enough to know if they survived everything. But at the end of it, what are the wrong implementations of blockchain, of DLTs, really?
Yeah, so, I think first question, most of them did not survive it. Most of those folks that, kind of blockchain by label, if you like, they really didn't have a legitimate business. They didn't even have legitimate technology. And even the white papers were, flimsy at best. But mainly, blockchain or not, if you have a business, you need to run a business, right? There's some basic, just supply and demand. There's basic economics. There's basic, you have to set a culture. There's all kinds of things that you can't, kind of like fast track just because you're calling yourself blockchain. So that's a fallacy. Kind of, I guess, what is blockchain? What there's all kinds of use cases for it, right? I think that certainly the first one, the one that is still prevalent is really Bitcoin. That's the big one, right? And Bitcoin is legitimate. It is a cryptocurrency. It has now become very much a holding asset, and one that, as I'm sure you've seen and you've heard, it has become an institutional play. So therefore, a legitimate holding asset, not just for kind of like cyberpunks or blockchain developers, people like us. I think that the reason really is well, again, let's go back a step. Currency and the value of currencies is really largely collective fiction. It's what you think it is, right? And the more people believe it, the more it winds up being the case. And with blockchain, you kind of have this idea of a network effect, right? But when it comes to price of Bitcoin, again, I think it's largely, what you would consider as collective fiction. But it turns out that all of this institutional money going in, that collective fiction is gaining real strength. And there's some material kind of reasoning they could put behind it. Not least the fact that there's a lot of transparency. The code is out there. We know what the final circulation is going to be. We know when the halving is going to happen. None of that is a surprise. So it's not like, like the U.S. government where it can print money anytime it wants to. There's a finite, circulation to it, right? So therefore, if you believe in Bitcoin and more institutional money is going in there, the more you look at the actual, kind of mechanics behind it and say, well, this is legit. This is transparent. So in that context, I think I certainly believe in Bitcoin. In the larger context of where DLT has gone and use cases and things like this, honestly, I think there's, and you and I have spoken about this noise signal, kind of concept. I think there's too much noise about just financial instruments and derivatives of things you can do, with cryptocurrencies and tokens and things like this, versus other use cases. Yeah, because there's a whole bunch of, for instance, compliance-related use cases that really apply in our world of life sciences and healthcare and track and trace and COVID vaccinations and things like this, that people are not necessarily spending a whole lot of energy on, or they're not, at the very least, they're not educating the rest of the world about, right? There's a lot of the noise seems to get funneled into this like DeFi and financial instruments and the ups and downs in coin market cap and things like this.
So you talk about legit tech, and you talk about you mentioned a few things, including asset tracking. You talked about COVID. Let's pick one piece at a time. Mm-hmm. We've been struggling with COVID now for about a year and a half. What are some appropriate use cases you've seen that would constitute legit tech, where DLTs, and just to be clear for those of you who don't know what that means, is distributed ledger technology. Blockchain is not the only way to do it. There are other ways to do it, and that's what DLT stands for. But what are the appropriate ways, legit tech that's been applied in the context of COVID? And what were some things that you saw where you went, something about this seems fishy? And we don't need names, we just need context.
Yes, the innocent shall be protected.
The guilty shall be protected.
Yeah, or the guilty, depending on your point of view. So look, what can you do, like in terms of public health, not just for COVID? I think to me, the underlying kind of principle that needs to be upheld is this idea of, is the data accurate? Is it complete? Can it be trusted? Right? Because public health, and again, COVID is a very good example, is where a disease or some kind of a public, something that impacts the public, is happening, and we need to take action. We as in governments, individuals like us, communities, advocacy groups, you name it, depending on the context. So therefore, and again, COVID is a very good example, but is also, it's not by no means the only example. Ebola was a good example. Zika is another good example. Other forms of flu or whatever, where, we need to take action because lack of action or late or untimely action can lead to loss of lives, right? At its most exaggerated, and kind of worst scenario, which we've seen, unfortunately. So what I would say is really, these diseases, they don't respect boundaries of geography, time zones, political boundaries, right? They move, and we've seen it with COVID. So ultimately, you got to think, at scale, and got to think really at a global kind of perspective, which is, how do you get information about this that's accurate, that's complete, it's sent to the right people at the right time, and it's then recommendations are provided by us go back to the public, so we can protect ourselves, and then governments can make the right kind of investments at the right time. So to me, all of this really comes down to this idea of, is the data, are we able to manage the data? Are we able to collect the data correctly? Are we able to then get that data, parsed and formatted and things like this and sent to the right places, such as government databases and things like this? Are epidemiologists, in case of COVID, able to get that data in a timely manner, make recommendations that then the government agencies, essentially take action on? I'm dumbing it down, obviously. Sure. So it's a data problem. And again, going back to your question of like, well, where does blockchain fit? Well, my philosophy with blockchain is that it's really always data before blockchain, right? If you don't have your data kind of philosophy and your data strategy and technology sorted out, blockchain is not going to help. It's going to make it worse. It's going to give you a more restricted data kind of architecture and a immutable kind of tracking mechanism, amongst other things. But what you essentially wind up with is garbage in, tamper-proof garbage forever. That's like the worst case scenario, right? So you got to sort out data. You got to figure out, again, let's take COVID as a specific example. So Sure. It is happening right now. So as example, when you go to this mom and pop kind of like testing centers, like with these tents that are set up or in parking lots, right?
Yeah.
That's not the same as going to LabCorp with all of the technologies they have and all of the back end, like electronic health record systems and reporting systems. So the question is, I'm going into this kind of pop-up clinic in a parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
I get a result, but then what happens next? Does the state know about my result because I need to by law? And then eventually the CDC does. But how long does that take to happen? Is it not by paper? Is it redundant? Is that data when say the CDC gets it eventually, is it in a format that they can use? And unfortunately, the answer in most of those cases is not really, right? There are issues. There's data accuracy issues. There's data kind of completeness issues. Along the way, as the data moves, there's a likelihood, I'm not going to say high likelihood necessarily, there's a likelihood that data is manipulated or either inadvertently or intentionally, where it's no longer either accurate or in the complete manner it's supposed to be, all kinds of things like this. So those are the things that we're going to address, right? And then where blockchain can really help is okay, as the data goes from that parking lot, pop-up testing center, with the swab or the remote diagnostic testing tool or whatever it is, as it goes from there all through all of the different hops that it needs to, ultimately to CDC or to HHS for national reporting and then back to the states as example. Can we use a technology to prove that certain actions happen, that it was really Jim who touched it at this point, and then it passed on to Darshan, and then eventually moved to this person at HHS, protect, and so on. And blockchain can do that. Blockchain can allow you to do that and allow you to have a kind of a computational way of looking at that provenance, the chain of custody, right? But if you don't have good data, if you don't fix data, kind of parsing, data aggregation, data, there's a lot, obviously, in our world of pharma, like data anonymization, removing PII, things like this. If you don't do those things correctly, well, blockchain can only show that you did those things incorrectly.
It's an interesting statement. Blockchain can only show you did those things incorrectly.
It can show you the way you did it. It just doesn't, just because it's there, it doesn't mean that you actually did it correctly. It doesn't mean that your data strategy was actually up to snuff and really did what it was supposed to do. Right.
So you've got a situation now where the data is being put in. You're saying that the data during transfer can become messed up and or become inaccurate.
Absolutely.
In my head, I'm visualizing someone corrupting the data. Well, why would anyone bother corrupting the data of individuals in COVID? Like, what would the impetus for that be?
Yeah, so it's not really. I don't think it's so much a nefarious use case. So it could be, like when there's an enormous amount of money, and there is an enormous amount of money, right, that's being dedicated to this to solve this global pandemic and this issue that's impacting all of us. There's always opportunity for scammers. There's opportunity for skimmers. We saw it with the wall, right? We saw it with the clemency, and things like this, for people who skim money on supposedly money that's going in for building the wall. I don't doubt. I don't have specific examples, nor do I want to get into that conversation. That this also happened here. But let's assume that there are, we all along the way, along the hops, you have good intentions. There's still plenty of opportunity for that data to essentially be dirtied up, for lack of a better term. It's misformed. It could be misformed. It could be that the transformation from one format to another is done poorly, or some data elements are either messed up or they're missed completely, and things like this, right? All those things can happen. Or that you essentially hit pockets where data is no longer moving, right? Where it's supposed to move, but it's not moving. And then, you have issues in terms of like, is the data integrity being impacted because somewhere along the hops, data is quote being lost or getting lost. All those things are pretty common things, right?
Right.
And then when you
migrate,
migrate,
at a global level.
And when you migrate from any system to any other system, and clearly we're talking about multiple systems here, there's a very high likelihood that you could have some migration issues. Very common things, right? That just happen when you're doing this kind of stuff.
So obviously what you're saying is that having appropriate controls in place would help in data transparency. You can identify exactly where things went wrong, and therefore hopefully catch them and fix them. And that technically even do that retrospectively, because you'd find out technically retrospectively that went wrong. But one of the things that's been used, and we had a very brief discussion on this a little bit earlier, was that one of the advantages of DLTs is the fact that they are trustless environments. And we're talking about the big reason to use them is because they are quote unquote trustless environments. You pointed out the fact that it obviously is useful for enhancing trust, but you don't like the term trustless. Why is that?
I think it's loaded. I think it's easy to misinterpret. And also, again, we're geeks, right, Darshan? So we like terms that are technically accurate and have singular meaning that you're not going to confuse. So as example, you mentioned blockchain earlier, and then comparison to DLTs. So technically speaking, a blockchain is really, an example would be Bitcoin. It's really where you have blocks of data that are chained together, and there's an origin or genesis block, if you like. And then every block thereafter is added to it. And one of the reasons why it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to hack the Bitcoin network is that in order for you to change a block, you have to essentially change all of the blocks that are chained to it. Whereas a distributed ledger technology, DLT, doesn't necessarily have to have chain blocks. So as example, the work that we do a lot of work with this technology called Hedera Hashgraph. It uses a different kind of consensus algorithm called asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance. Not to get into technical details, but that's different to the proof of work algorithm that Bitcoin uses. And also the structure, the if you like, the data structure is different to this idea of chaining blocks. So back to the idea of trustless, is I kind of feel like it's one of those things where you can easily either misinterpret it or have a conflated meaning for what it really is supposed to, kind of explain. So what I really kind of prefer saying is this idea of essentially having computational trust, where you trust code, software, typically open source software that you can interrogate, or code that you can interrogate. And this idea of like an entity, if you like, that, for instance, you could try, you could have like a clearinghouse that you send transactions to, right? And then they send it on to the merchants or the payers or whatever, and you trust them, right? Or a bank, as an example, that role is being played by software, right? So there is no one entity, there is no one kind of person, and you're in this distributed, but more importantly, decentralized network where you and we're individual nodes. There could be 50 other ones, and all 50 of us essentially quote own that network, right? It's not like one of us doesn't own it. It's not like a hub and spoke model, right? So back to trustless, I prefer kind of going down a little bit more elaborate explanation of you're trusting software as opposed to an intermediary or a person, and that software you can interrogate, right? And it's really typically based on very strong cryptography. Is based on very strong consensus algorithms that are mathematically proven, over many decades, actually, not just overnight. So you can interrogate it. You can have experts look at it, and experts not just in technology, but also people like yourself, actually, like lawyers, look at it and go through it and say, all right, if Jim says they're gonna have this kind of computational trust through this software, can I essentially triangulate that statement with a legal statement of trust, right? Which obviously you would need to, right? Because there are many occasions where you have to quote have a legal trust. Yeah. So that's the way I think about it. I think again, I think we as technologists tend to use terms and things that kind of have a very specific meaning for us, but they're largely nebulous and conflated meanings for the rest of the world, and then we confuse everyone.
So you talk about we talked about trustless environments, or what that actually means, and we talked about this idea of legit technology. We talked about COVID, and you talked about one of the big problems is that as you start migrating from system to system, you introduce errors. One of the conversations I remember having with you several years ago at this point
I'm going to
was
deny that, but okay.
was this idea of how everything right now is owned by big data in different silos, and how silos are going to be broken down. You're going to have many little data, if you will, as opposed to one big data. First of all, do you think that that's still accurate?
Yeah, so I would say, again, I don't remember all of this, but what I would say though is that this idea of siloed data is incredibly prevalent and real, and today, certainly in healthcare and pharma, life sciences, and we know this. I mean, for crying out loud, you could have patient safety data.
Yeah,
that is fundamentally, and you know this better than I do in the pharma world, where patient safety data for one specific condition and one specific drug is an entirely different database, in kind of development versus in pharmacovigilance for the same patient.
Yeah.
I mean, you can just imagine how, the issues that one simple example can lead to. But unfortunately, there's literally, 1,000+ examples of that in healthcare, pharma, and in public health. I mean, and we see the manifestations, the negative manifestations of those things all the time. I think honestly, I'm not a big fan of like quote big data. I think there's opportunity to do a lot with, kind of aggregated data, but you don't, technology is at a place where you don't necessarily need to like create this gigantic, data warehouse to get value. You could do it through federated learning. You could do it through homomorphic encryption and do machine learning on encrypted data on, in stream. And also, frankly, I feel like what we need to be in healthcare in particular, people like you and I, is efficacy of patients owning their own data, having access to their own data, providing informed consent for anyone to use the data, and not necessarily to say, you know what, hey, XYZ data aggregator, you have my blessing to essentially have $1 billion business off of my data, right? Which is really what's happening, has happened.
So a couple of different things. So number one, you talked about advocacy of data. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the latest California law called CIPRA. And they're talking about owning your own data. So that should be really interesting. We can have a different conversation about that at a different point. But we talked about different DLTs. We talked about how each of them has their advantages. One of the big disadvantages I've always heard with blockchain, specifically in the context of Bitcoin, has been that you can only do, I think, 6 transactions per second.
About 7, 5 to 7, yeah.
Yeah.
Traffic, yep.
Sure. When you're dealing with large volumes of data like you are in pharma, my question for you is, what is, in your experience, is there a right system to use? Is there a right DLT? Obviously, you're a big fan of Hedera.
Yeah.
Is Hedera the right system? What are the advantages, disadvantages compared to something else? And how do you make that decision?
Yeah, so I wish the answer were that straightforward. It's always more nuanced. And as you know, Darshan, we talked about this a lot of times. You need to kind of look at what it is that you actually want to do. So there's an application, there's software, there's architecture, there's a data element that you have to figure out. And blockchain is just a playground in a theme park, right? My whole theme park thing, right? So, and I think you got to keep it in context. So look, you could use the Bitcoin network, and many people do. And again, Bitcoin network is not the same as Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency. It's the network is the network infrastructure that allows you to have Bitcoin, but you can do a lot more. And many companies like Microsoft, as example, has publicly talked about the commitment to doing things on the Bitcoin network. If you look at there's a bunch of protocols that are building on the Bitcoin network because it's proven to work. However, you don't necessarily need to do all of the work on the Bitcoin network. You could do some of it off the chain. You could use what's called layer 2, kind of technologies where really some of the work is taken off chain and you essentially reconcile transactions on the chain, or you do it at minimum with minimum kind of metadata or minimum amount of information. So there's literally like 1,000 ways to kind of skin the cat, if you like. So I don't think you can just make a, kind of a carte blanche statement saying this is better than that without having like some kind of a consideration to what's really happening and what the use case is. What I would say though is this: some of the next generation technologies that are out there, Hedera is one that we use. It's not really blockchain. It's not technically blockchain, it's DLT. However, what they have figured out is a mechanism where you can get to consensus, which is really the most important thing, that you got to do, which is for nodes, for computers to essentially agree that a transaction happened, and that was a transaction. So get to consensus very, very quickly at very large scale, but also, and this is the important thing, I think, in a very economically viable way, right? Because if you look at Ethereum right now, layer 1 Ethereum, the mainnet Ethereum, even if you remove the scaling, kind of questions and conversations and use layer 2 technologies and things like this, or you do things offline, the transaction fee is pretty high. I think I forget exactly, maybe like $2.50, something like this, to have a transaction in the mainnet. That's a vast difference than like 0.0001 cent on the Hedera network, right? So that's one of the key reasons why we like, Hedera, and because we're proponents of doing real-time transactions to the tunes of millions of transactions a day, right? If you're going to do that, you need to have a model where the underlying cryptocurrency, that the underlying token has to allow you to do that at scale, but also in an economically reasonable way. Because otherwise, nobody would ever buy our technologies, because you're kind of like, if you're like, your shipping costs is just too high. It winds up being too much money for what then people would say, essentially is a regulatory or an auditing type of function, as opposed to, operational function.
So what I think is interesting is you talk about the advantages of Hedera, which obviously are apparent when you're talking about cost, but one might argue that Ethereum, or the blockchain, the Bitcoin backbone, if you will, has proven to be a time-tested system.
Yeah.
And really, one of the big things you see, whether it's in tech and you're talking on mainframes, or you're talking about pharma, and you're talking about just data in pharma, is trust, and knowing that the system works.
Yep.
Would people argue that, and I'm speaking as a novice, would people argue that Hedera may be all those things, but we don't really know because we haven't tested them out yet?
Yeah, but this is, you actually hit on kind of the underlying kind of crux of what you have to consider when you're looking at again, a public blockchain, right? Because we're talking about, if you're talking what enterprise blockchain or private blockchain, you really don't have this concept of network effect, token economics, things like this. That really kind of comes into public blockchain. And as you know, you and I have spoken about this many, many times. I'm a proponent of using public blockchain, because ultimately I think the biggest thing is this idea of transparent trust, and transparency, and reporting on it, right? Regardless of how much money it costs or how quick it is, and things like this. So that's a very good counter argument, which is, hey, look, Bitcoin's been around for 12 years, never been hacked. There's millions of nodes around the world, right? It's permissionless.
Right.
Anybody can, just download, the software, get the GPU, you're up and running. But, it may take a couple of days for you to index all of the blocks, but then you'd be a node, right? All that is good. It makes perfect sense. Hedera doesn't have that. There's like 16 nodes, and those are permission nodes, because they're basically the 16 council members right out there. And in time, there will be a, permissionless model where you and I could have nodes on it, things like this, but hasn't got there. So therefore hasn't passed the test of time, hasn't passed the true test of maturity and growth. Those are all good, counter arguments. What I would say though is my, I guess, additional kind of line of thinking is, let's look at the business plan. Let's look at things like, so with a public blockchain, really ultimately, the more nodes you have, the more secure it is, because what you're doing is that you're really, typically for the modern ones, you're staking the tokens. And if the tokens are distributed, kind of somewhat proportionally, and the more nodes you have, the more tokens that are in play, the more accounts you have, the more likely they're secure, right? It kind of comes down to this, and again, there's a lot of mathematical proofs behind this that I don't think we need to get into at this moment. But all to say, it's kind of this catch-22, right? Because in order to be more secure, you have to grow the network. right?
Right.
In order to grow a network, you have to have more people, so they have to believe that it's secure,
Right.
right? And this is really where to me, the cleverness of token economics comes into it. It's this game theory, this to and fro of, well, how do you grow the network and get, quote, network effect, if you're just starting out, right? And how do you incentivize people to do so? How do you convince them? So I think where I am with this is that I look at some other factors, such as the team. The Hedera team I really like. They're the seasoned professionals. They have a game plan that's like at least 15 years. They basically publicly have said that they want Hedera to be the kind of like trust layer for the internet and have a 100-year business plan, right? So, and this in our world of healthcare and pharma, I mean, units of time are measured in decades, certainly not months, right? It's really decades, right? So it would be ludicrous for us to go to somebody and say, hey, boss over at Novartis, this investment is going to pay off in a year.
Right.
Nobody really is going to take it seriously. So I kind of like that. It's more seasoned, it's laid out, but also I like that there is a token release cycle that's proportional to this idea of a long-term growing of the network effect and long-term security of this public blockchain. And again, not to get into all of the details, but it's designed so that somebody could not, at least it would be very, very difficult to game the system, to essentially have one miner that can basically control the entire network. Because if one miner can do that, then all of a sudden you have a leader node, and it's no longer a public blockchain. Now you're talking about basically a private blockchain with a different label. Again, we could spend hours in all of these like areas, because every one of them really deserves, if you want to get technical, deserves a conversation. But the net of it is, you have to look at some other factors than just the consensus algorithm or the white paper. You have to look at the team. You have to look at like the token circulation timeline and really ultimately, again, look at the governance model. That's, to me, one of the things I really like about Hedera is this governance model. They put it out there as public, the 39 nodes eventually, and their 3-year terms, the global distribution, the fact that they're essentially set up to have 139 ownership of the network. And you have companies like Boeing and Google and Wipro and like big companies, UCL, University College of London, etc. These are big institutes that have been around for a long time and likely to be around, and not necessarily to kind of like collude with each other for a reason. So all of those things, kind of like counterweigh this argument that it's not yet proven. So
you're right. It does help counterweight the argument that it's not proven. The question then becomes, let's say you want to invest into a Hedera system. Is that potentially the right system as you start considering things like asset tracking, and as you start considering things like, because that's track and trace. You talked about track and trace a little bit ago. So talk to me a little bit about your experiences creating processes around track and trace.
Yeah, so I mean, to your first question, is it the right system? In my experience with the use cases we've come across, yes, mostly yes. Is it always yes? We don't know, because it's not every situation. Like for instance, I'm working with some folks, who are working with Helium and essentially kind of long fi and dealing with kind of basically connecting everything like full IoT and on remote locations and farms and things like this. So is it the right solution for that? Maybe not. I don't know, to be honest. I don't know enough because I haven't really spent all the time on it. Maybe. But so I think, again, you have to kind of really understand the requirements. In terms of track and trace specifically, I would say for most of the use cases I've come across, yes. What would we look into? Essentially comes down to, can you track, like typically there's a physical element to it. Can you track the physical element and the digital element together? Because they kind of, like for instance, if I have a QR code on a container or a box that's within a container, can I track those singularly? But then can I track the metadata and the digital flow? Because there's always a flow. So those are the things we look at. We work with this startup in Uganda, and they were literally tracking agriculture and produce all the way from like with the farmer in an actual farm,
Right.
all the way through the distribution, in Uganda, and then all the way to essentially getting it to European countries, right? And I think this was specifically around vanilla, where Uganda has a has a strong, I guess, agriculture business in vanilla, but the buyers wanted to make sure that the quality of the produce all the way from the farms were maintained, were up to the standards that we're expecting, but also that it was, there were no human rights issues and there was no like third parties corrupting the process and things like this. So, could you do that with with Hedera or some other next generation technology, DLT? Yeah, I mean, for sure you could do it.
But here's the question: how do you convince a farmer in Uganda to use Hedera, to use the system?
And that's really is very, very important, Darshan, that we kind of abstract what is an architectural component of a solution versus what an actual user would use. What would a user use? A user should use like a device like this, like a phone, or like an iPad, and it should be as easy as humanly possible. They scan a QR code. That's what they do, right?
Yeah. Okay.
All of the mumbo jumbo is abstracted to them, like the DLT, what we do, the data stamping, the visualization, the anonymization of data. All of these things should be abstracted, because if they have to worry about those things, it will never happen.
Right.
If they had to worry about dealing with native like cryptocurrency wallets and managing their private keys and things like this, forget about it. Are you kidding me? It will never happen.
Right.
So that's really where people like us, like myself, would come in with my team, is like, what is the user experience here? What do we have to build? All these things that we want to do to make the data trustworthy, they need to be abstracted from the user. Like a patient shouldn't care that we're using blockchain to essentially prove that they gave us informed consent, right? They give us informed consent using their phone, they use their, Face ID, right?
Yeah.
It's captured. But then if the FDA says, hey, Jim, prove to me that Darshan actually did provide this informed consent, because you're saying that, he's met the inclusion criteria for this, I don't know, like some drug that's being tested.
Yeah.
We need to prove that. And then somewhere along the way, sponsor has to prove it.
What does the word prove mean here? It means that I show up as an entry on the chain?
It shows that, not necessarily you, it shows that particular transaction being that you basically provided consent through this app,
okay,
for your information to be shared in an anonymized way with a clinical trial sponsor. I'm dumbing it down, obviously.
Sure.
That transaction happened, at 18:04 on January 21st from this IP address to whatever, but now it's in a tamper-proof ledger where I couldn't have gone or Liddy couldn't have gone and changed that record to meet our convenience.
Got it. One last question. I know this, we usually aim for 15 to 20 minutes, but we're well beyond that because you're always interesting. You talked about disparate systems, and I find the conversation around disparate systems to be really interesting, because here's what I need you to correct me if I'm wrong, but could DLTs or blockchains be a way of connecting disparate systems so that they aren't disparate anymore, because the information still comes to a central location? Yeah,
the answer is no. Right.
Okay.
Right? Simply the answer is no, because fundamentally it's an apples versus oranges problem that we're talking about.
Okay.
I think what you can show is, and again, it's not easy, but you can show basically like cross references of data across different systems with a DLT, but you really can't like de-silo data with a DLT. That's a fallacy.
Interesting. But now, if I want to know if person X did Y thing, and he's using one system, and then I also want to know person Z did A thing, and he's using another system, they're all still coming onto the same blockchain or the same DLT system, and we're tracking it. So isn't that still a way of quote unquote de-siloing?
Well, I mean, this gets into the whole and gnarly area of identity management, right? Which again, identity management is not the same as blockchain, right? I mean, yes, there's some overlap potentially, surely it could be, but if you are doing kind of decentralized identity management and you use blockchain, and if that decentralized identity management or like some reference to it, like a QR code as example, is available across the different disparate systems and cross-reference on the DLT, then yes. But there's a lot of ifs in there, right? There's many ifs. So if you're going to qualify to that level and you can technically prove it, then yes. But honestly, is the whole identity management piece is still incredibly immature. I would say where we're at right now, honestly, is verified credentials. That's where we're at. But verified credentials is not the same as DIDs. It's not the same as decentralized identification, right?
So we're not in a place where we can verify identity. Okay, I'm gonna try to stop this. Any last words, Jim? How can people reach you if they need someone else who can tell them more about DLT than they ever knew they needed to know?
Yes, I think after this performance, I will not have any takers on that.
I disagree.
At Jim Nasr, and then on our website, jnasr@acore.com as well. So yeah,
this was awesome. Thanks again, Jim. This was awesome.
Thank you, Dr. K. Always good to talk to you.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory Guy, Irregular Podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.